There's a moment, quiet, almost imperceptible, when someone simply stops. Stops sending the first text, stops finding reasons to bring the conversation back around, stops rearranging your own life just to try to make it work with someone, stops romanticizing crumbs, waiting on replies that take too long, reading meaning into signals that were never actually clear. And from the outside, this usually looks like giving up, or worse, it looks cold, like you've lost faith in love. But if you've ever actually lived through that moment, you know it isn't that at all. It isn't the absence of hope. It's the opposite. It's the first time in a long time that you choose yourself before you choose the possibility of being chosen by someone else. And psychology has a fairly precise explanation for this kind of shift, one that has nothing to do with giving up on love and everything to do with finally stopping the chase, the exhausting attempt to prove you deserve to exist by running after someone who never quite turns around. Today I want to show you what's actually happening in your mind when you reach this point, why it so often gets mistaken for giving up, and why, most of the time, it's actually the opposite. It's the moment you finally become available for real love, instead of staying trained to chase ghosts. Behavioral psychology explains that chasing someone over and over, desperately, is rarely about that specific person. It's about a pattern learned much earlier, usually in childhood, when affection from important figures was inconsistent, conditional, or hard to reach. When a child has to work too hard to get attention, whether by being funny, being extra good, being easy, performing in some way just to be noticed, the brain learns a very clear equation. Love is something you earn through effort, never something that simply exists because you exist. And it's exactly that equation, written in too early, that has you chasing distant, inconsistent, emotionally unavailable partners as an adult, without fully understanding why it feels so familiar, so right, even while it hurts that much. This is where attachment psychology adds an even more specific explanation. If you have an anxious attachment pattern, you tend to confuse intensity with real connection. You feel a rush of relief the moment you finally get a reply after hours of silence, and you interpret that relief as passion, as a sign that this is something special. But in reality, that relief is just your nervous system exiting a state of alert. It isn't evidence of compatibility, and it definitely isn't evidence of real love. It's simply the temporary absence of anxiety getting mistaken for the presence of love. And that cycle, repeated over and over, is extremely addictive because it functions exactly like any other intermittent reinforcement. You never know when the next good response is coming, so you keep trying, chasing the next hit. So what actually happens when you finally stop chasing? Usually, it isn't a decision you make overnight. It's a process of accumulated exhaustion where your body, before your mind even catches up, starts refusing to keep going through that cycle. You notice you're always tired after interactions that should have felt joyful. You notice you're constantly analyzing behavior, constantly calculating the next move, always a little on alert, even when you're trying to relax. And at some point, your body simply says, enough, before your mind can even put that feeling into words. It's almost as if your nervous system finally understands that the pattern was never providing any real safety, just exhaustion dressed up as hope. There's also an important cognitive factor at play here: emotional decision fatigue. Every time you interpret an ambiguous behavior, trying to decide whether it means interest or disinterest, your brain spends real mental energy doing that math. And when this repeats hundreds of times, over months or years, you start to feel a kind of tiredness that goes far beyond that one specific relationship. It's the accumulated exhaustion of living in a constant state of interpretation, trying to decode signals that were never clear enough to begin with. And that exhaustion, more than any single rational decision, is usually the real trigger behind the shift. One important thing psychology points out: stopping the chase doesn't mean you stop wanting love. It actually means completely redefining what counts as real love in the first place. Once you go through this shift, you start noticing the difference between wanting someone and needing someone's attention to validate your own existence. You start noticing that feeling intensity isn't the same thing as feeling safe. That constantly missing someone isn't automatically a sign of deep connection. Sometimes it's just anxiety wearing romance as a costume. And once you reach that clarity, it's nearly impossible to unsee because it completely changes the filter you use to evaluate any future possibility. There's also a piece of this tied directly to self-worth. If you've spent years chasing someone, you likely developed an unconscious belief that you need to constantly prove your value through effort, availability, endless patience, or the capacity to put up with more than anyone else would. And when you finally stop, it's often not because you gave up on love, it's because for the first time you understood that your worth was never conditional on how much you could endure in order to be chosen. And that single shift in belief is enough on its own to completely reorganize the kind of relationship you're willing to accept going forward. Something interesting also happens socially once you go through this shift. The people around you often read this new posture as coldness, as someone who's closed themselves off. But what's actually happening is the opposite of closing off. It's discernment. You didn't stop loving, you stopped loving indiscriminately, with anyone, under any condition. You simply raised the standard for what counts as real reciprocity. And ironically, this tends to attract far healthier connections because emotionally available partners tend to recognize and actually value that kind of inner security, while inconsistent partners tend to disappear, precisely because they can no longer generate the intensity cycle that used to work so well on you. Now, something important needs to be said. This change isn't instant, and slipping back into the old pattern once in a while doesn't mean you've failed. Behavioral psychology explains that patterns learned decades ago don't disappear all at once. They weaken gradually through conscious repetition of a new behavior. There are practical steps that actually help with this process. The first is learning to recognize in your own body the difference between anxiety and genuine desire. Paying attention to whether what you feel before sending a message is light excitement or a desperate release of built-up tension. The second is practicing tolerance for the discomfort of silence without filling that space with impulsive action, letting uncertainty exist without needing to solve it immediately through more effort. The third is honestly observing whether the attention you're receiving is consistent or just occasional enough to keep you hopeful, because that distinction alone reveals a lot about the other person's actual emotional availability. And the fourth step is consciously redirecting the energy that used to go entirely toward the other person, back toward yourself, investing in your own interests, friendships, and personal goals. Because a life that feels full on the inside naturally reduces the urgency to fill any gap through someone else. There is also a curious detail about the exact timing of this shift. It often doesn't happen during a crisis, but right after one, in an unexpected moment of calm. You can spend months, sometimes years, inside the emotional storm, and the decision to stop doesn't show up at the peak of the pain. It shows up in a moment of quiet, when there's finally room to see, clearly, how much energy was being spent trying to keep alive a connection that was never fully yours to sustain alone. It's almost as if the mind needs to move through the whole chaos first, before it can finally step back far enough to actually see the pattern and choose to change it. In the end, giving up the chase isn't about giving up on love. It's about giving up on a version of it that was never real, one that always demanded too much effort just to look believable. It's understanding that real love doesn't require constant pursuit, doesn't demand repeated proof, doesn't leave you exhausted trying to decode signals all day long. Real love, according to pretty much the entire psychological consensus on healthy relationships, looks a lot more like rest than like a hunt. And maybe that's exactly what you finally learn when you stop chasing, that you don't lose love by stopping. You just make room for it if it's real to finally reach you. If this resonated with you, drop this sentence in the comments below. I don't chase what doesn't choose me. And if you want to keep exploring psychology, relationships, and human behavior, consider subscribing to the channel, because we're going to keep this conversation going right here. Thanks for watching all the way through, and I'll see you in the next video.